Welcome to this quiet hour. You have found your way here at the end of the day, and that is enough. Let yourself settle. Let the weight of the day lift, piece by piece. There is no rush here, no urgency, just a story that moves at its own pace. Tonight, we are going to follow the people of medieval England through a single winter night. For them, winter was not a season to endure with a thermostat or a light switch. It was something to navigate with care, with routine, with the knowledge passed down through generations. Their world grew dark early. The sun disappeared before 4 in the afternoon. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and there was no central heating to push back the cold. No electric lights to hold back the darkness. What they had instead were small fires, woven walls, wool blankets, and straw. They had livestock sleeping in the next room, adding their warmth to the air. They had rituals for banking embers so the fire would last until morning. They had a way of sleeping that has mostly been forgotten. This is not a story of hardship or survival against the odds. It is simply the story of how people lived, how they prepared for the night, how they kept warm, how they slept. So settle in. Let the hours unfold. We are going back to a time when the night was something you had to plan for, and sleep was shaped by the absence of light. In medieval England, the sun did not linger. By late afternoon in the depths of winter, the light was already fading. At the latitude of London, sunset came as early as 3:51 in the afternoon. In the northern counties, in Yorkshire and Northumbria, the day ended even sooner. This was not a gentle twilight that stretched into evening. The darkness came quickly. Fields and forests lost their definition. The cold, which had been present all day, seemed to deepen as the light withdrew. For the people living in timber cottages and stone manor houses, this early darkness was not an inconvenience. It was the structure of their lives. Work followed the light. When the sun set, the workday ended. There was no point in continuing. Candles and rushlights were too precious to waste on labour that could wait until morning. The rhythm of the household shifted with the sunset. Tools were set aside. Livestock were brought in from the fields or checked in their stalls. Doors were closed. Shutters were pulled across window openings, blocking the draughts that would otherwise seep through. Inside, the focus turned inward. The hearth became the centre of all activity. It was the only source of heat and light, and the household gathered around it instinctively. The fire had been burning all day, but now it took on a different role. It was no longer just for cooking or warmth during the work hours. It was the anchor for the evening and the night ahead. The transition from day to night was not abrupt in terms of activity. There were still tasks to complete. The animals needed final attention. The fire needed tending. Food needed to be prepared and eaten. But the quality of time changed. The pace slowed. Movements became quieter, more deliberate. This was the nature of winter evenings in medieval England. The world outside became inaccessible. The cold settled into the ground, into the stones of buildings, into the air itself. Inside, the household withdrew into a smaller, warmer space. The radius of life contracted to the area around the hearth, to the bodies gathered close, to the small zone where the fire's heat could reach. There was no sense of missing the outdoors. The landscape in winter offered nothing but cold and darkness. The retreat indoors was natural, even necessary. It was not seen as confinement. It was simply where life happened once the sun was gone. The arrival of darkness also brought a psychological shift. The day's labour was finished. There was nothing more that could be done until the sun returned. This created a kind of permission to rest, to slow down, to turn attention to the immediate needs of warmth and food and eventually sleep. In towns, the darkness was marked by the ringing of bells. The curfew bell, which we will return to later, signalled the hour when fires should be covered. But even in isolated farmsteads and rural cottages where no bell could be heard, the routine was the same. The darkness imposed its own order. Children, if there were any in the household, were often the first to show signs of fatigue. The cold and the dim light made it harder to stay active. They would settle near the fire, wrapped in whatever fabric was available, and begin to drift towards sleep even before the formal preparations for the night began. For adults, the evening hours were a time of quiet work. Mending, sorting, preparing materials for the next day. These were tasks that could be done by firelight, that did not require the full brightness of day. Conversations happened, but they were low and steady, not animated. The tone of the household matched the tone of the season. The arrival of darkness was the first step in a sequence that would carry the household through the night. It was not dramatic. It was simply the signal that the next phase had begun. The fire would need to be managed. The bedding would need to be arranged. The body would need to be prepared for the long hours of cold that lay ahead. And so, as the last of the daylight faded, the people of medieval England turned their attention to the practical work of staying warm. They did not think of it as survival. It was simply what you did when winter came and the sun disappeared early. It was routine, repeated every night for months, until the days began to lengthen again, and the worst of the cold finally passed. The cold that medieval English people experienced was not an accident of weather. It was part of a larger shift in the climate of the Northern Hemisphere, a period that would later be called the Little Ice Age. This cooling began around the year 1300. The change was gradual at first, measured in fractions of a degree. But over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, the cumulative effect became undeniable. Average temperatures dropped by more than half a degree across the Northern Hemisphere. In Europe, the decline was often steeper, reaching 1 to 2 degrees below the long-term averages. These numbers may seem small, but in the context of agriculture, of predictable seasons, of the narrow margin between survival and famine, even a single degree mattered. The signs of cooling were visible in the landscape. Glaciers in the Alps and Scandinavia, which had been retreating during the medieval warm period, began to advance again. In England, rivers that rarely froze became icebound in winter. The Thames froze over multiple times during this era, solid enough that people could walk across it. The growing season shortened. Harvests that had been reliable in previous centuries became uncertain. The summer of 1315 was cold and wet, and it was followed by another cold, wet summer in 1316. The crops failed across much of northern Europe. The result was the Great Famine, a period of widespread hunger that lasted for several years and reduced the population significantly. For the people living through these changes, there was no concept of a little ice age. They did not have temperature records or scientific models. What they had was lived experience. They knew that winters were colder than their grandparents remembered. They knew that snow lingered longer, that frost came earlier in the autumn and lasted later into the spring. The structure of the agricultural year shifted in response. Certain crops that had grown well in previous generations became unreliable. Wheat, which preferred warmer conditions, gave way to hardier grains like rye and barley. Livestock breeding adjusted to favour animals that could withstand longer winters. The cooling also affected the rhythm of daily life. With shorter growing seasons, there was less time for outdoor labour. The period of winter inactivity lengthened. Households had to store more food, more fuel, more of everything needed to survive the months when the land produced nothing. Inside the home, the experience of winter became more intense. The cold was deeper, more persistent. It was not enough to simply close the door and light a fire. The cold seeped through walls, through gaps in the thatch, through the earthen floors. It required constant attention, constant management. The medieval understanding of cold was tied to the theory of the four humours. Winter was a cold and moist season associated with the humour of phlegm. This was not just a medical theory. It shaped how people thought about their bodies, their health, their vulnerability to illness. Cold was understood as an active force, something that could invade the body and disrupt its balance. To stay healthy, you had to counteract the cold with heat. This meant warm foods, warm drinks, warm clothing, and above all, proximity to the fire. The winter landscape itself became inhospitable in a way that is difficult to imagine now. Fields were frozen and covered in snow. Roads became impassable. Travel, which was difficult even in good weather, became dangerous or impossible. The world contracted to the boundaries of the village, the farm, the immediate surroundings. For isolated households, this meant months of near-total self-sufficiency. There was no going to town for supplies, no visits from neighbours unless absolutely necessary. The household had to have everything it needed before the deep cold set in. This isolation reinforced the importance of preparation. Fuel had to be gathered and stored. Food had to be preserved. Repairs to the dwelling had to be completed before the ground froze and outdoor work became impossible. The autumn was a time of intense activity, driven by the knowledge that once winter arrived, there would be no second chances. The Little Ice Age also brought unpredictability. Some winters were worse than others. A mild winter could give way to a brutal one the following year. This variability made it impossible to relax the routines of preparation, even in years when the cold was less severe. For the people of medieval England, the climate they lived in was simply the climate they knew. They did not have the option of moving to a warmer region. They did not have the technology to overcome the cold with central heating or insulated buildings. What they had was knowledge, accumulated over generations, of how to live in a cold climate with limited resources. This knowledge was not written down in manuals or taught in schools. It was passed from parent to child, learned through observation and practice. It was embedded in the design of buildings, in the choice of materials, in the daily routines that governed life from autumn through spring. The Little Ice Age lasted for centuries. It did not end abruptly. The climate warmed slowly, erratically, over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. But for the people living in the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries, it was the only climate they knew, and they adapted to it with the tools and knowledge they had. The walls of a medieval peasant home were not solid barriers. They were woven structures, layered with earth and straw, designed to hold heat while still allowing moisture to pass through. This construction method was called wattle and daub. It was used across England from the southern counties to the northern uplands. The materials varied slightly depending on what was available locally, but the basic principle remained the same. The process began with the frame of the house. Vertical posts of oak or ash formed the skeleton of the structure. These were the primary supports driven into the ground or set on stone foundations. Between these posts, horizontal beams were fitted, creating a grid. Into this grid, the wattle was woven. Wattle was made from flexible branches, usually hazel or willow. These branches, called withies, were cut in the autumn or winter when the sap was down. They were then woven between the upright staves in a basket weave pattern, creating a lattice that filled the space between the structural timbers. The weaving was tight but not impermeable. The wattle created a flexible, resilient backing for the next layer. That layer was the daub. Daub was a mixture of clay, sand, straw, and often animal dung. The proportions varied, but the goal was always the same: to create a material that would stick to the wattle, harden as it dried, and provide both insulation and weatherproofing. The clay acted as the binder. It held the mixture together and gave it plasticity when wet. The sand or crushed stone provided structure and reduced cracking as the daub dried. The straw, and sometimes animal hair, reinforced the mixture and prevented it from crumbling. The inclusion of straw was particularly important for thermal performance. Straw is hollow. Each stalk contains air, and air is an excellent insulator. When the daub dried, these tiny air pockets remained trapped in the wall, creating a barrier against the cold. The daub was applied by hand, pressed into the wattle in thick layers. It took time to dry, especially in the damp English climate. But once it hardened, it formed a solid, durable surface that could last for decades with minimal maintenance. The walls were then finished with a layer of lime plaster on the interior and sometimes the exterior. This plaster sealed the daub, provided a smoother surface, and added another layer of protection against the weather. What made these walls remarkable was not just their thermal properties, but their flexibility. Unlike brick or stone, wattle and daub could move. The wooden frame of the house would shift and settle over time, especially in the first few years after construction. The wattle and daub moved with it, flexing without cracking. This flexibility also helped the walls cope with the expansion and contraction caused by temperature changes. On a freezing winter night, the materials would contract slightly. During the day, when the sun warmed the exterior, they would expand. The structure accommodated these movements without losing integrity. The walls also manage moisture in a way that modern, airtight construction does not. England is a damp climate. Rain is frequent and humidity is high, even in winter. A completely sealed wall would trap moisture inside the dwelling, leading to rot in the wooden frame and condensation on the interior surfaces. Wattle and daub allowed moisture to move through the wall, from the inside to the outside. This permeability prevented the build-up of damp and kept the interior air relatively dry, even when the exterior was wet. This did not mean the walls were drafty. When properly maintained, a wattle and daub wall was remarkably effective at blocking wind. The daub filled the gaps in the wattle completely, and the lime plaster sealed the surface. But the material itself remained breathable, allowing water vapour to pass through while blocking airflow. In wealthier households, the interior walls were often covered with additional layers of insulation. Wool tapestries were hung on the walls, not just for decoration, but to create a buffer of still air between the cold surface and the living space. Even in humbler cottages, woven mats or pieces of cloth served the same purpose. The thermal mass of the walls also played a role in regulating temperature. During the day, when the fire was burning and the interior was warm, the walls absorbed some of that heat. At night, as the fire died down, the walls released the stored heat slowly, helping to moderate the temperature drop. This was not a perfect system. The walls could not hold enough heat to keep the interior warm through the entire night, but they slowed the rate of cooling, which made the difference between tolerable cold and dangerous cold. The construction of these walls required skill and knowledge. It was not something you could do without training. But it was also not specialised labour that required a guild craftsman. Most rural communities had members who knew how to build and repair wattle and daub structures. The knowledge was widespread because it was essential. Repairs were ongoing. Daub would crack over time, especially around windows and doors where movement was greatest. These cracks had to be filled before winter to prevent drafts. The lime plaster would wear away and need to be reapplied. The thatch roof, which we will discuss in another chapter, also required regular maintenance. But the basic structure, if built well, could last for generations. There are wattle and daub buildings in England that are over 500 years old, still standing, still functional. For the people living in these homes, the walls were not a subject of admiration. They were simply the walls, but they represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to build in a cold, damp climate with limited resources. They were the first line of defence against the winter cold, and they performed that function remarkably well. In the Northern Highlands and on the moors of Dartmoor, the design of the dwelling reflected the harshness of the environment. These were places where winter was longer, colder and more isolating than in the southern counties. The solution was the Longhouse. This was a structure that brought the family and their livestock under a single roof. The layout was simple. The building was divided into two main sections. One end was the living area for the family. The other end was the shippon, the space for cattle, sheep or other animals. Between them was a cross passage, a corridor that ran from one side of the building to the other, with doors opening to the outside. The cross passage served as a transition zone. It separated the human space from the animal space, but it also allowed movement between them without going outside. In the depths of winter, this was crucial. You did not want to leave the shelter of the building to check on the livestock or to bring in fodder. The animals were not kept in the Longhouse out of sentiment. They were there because they generated heat. A cow at rest produces approximately 1 kilowatt of heat through its metabolic processes. This is not a trivial amount. In a small enclosed space, the heat from 6 or 8 cows could raise the temperature by several degrees. The walls between the shippon and the living area were not solid. They were permeable enough that the warmth from the animals could drift into the human space. The air in the Longhouse was never truly cold, even when the outside temperature dropped well below freezing. The animals also benefited from the arrangement. They were protected from the wind, from predators, from the worst of the cold. Calving in winter, which was a vulnerable time, could happen in the relative safety and warmth of the shippon. The survival rate of newborn animals was higher when they were born indoors. The floor of the shippon was often paved with stone or hard-packed earth, sloped slightly to allow drainage. A central channel ran the length of the space, collecting waste and channeling it outside. This was basic, but effective. It kept the living conditions for the animals manageable and prevented the accumulation of filth that could lead to disease. The smell was constant. There is no way around this. The Longhouse smelled of hay, of manure, of animals. But this was not considered unpleasant in the way it might be now. It was simply the smell of home in winter. It was associated with warmth, with life, with the herd that represented the family's wealth and security. The presence of the animals also created sound. The low breathing of cattle, the occasional shift of weight, the rustle of hay. These sounds were part of the sensory environment of the Longhouse. They were a form of reassurance. If you woke in the night and heard the animals, you knew everything was as it should be. The Longhouse was not unique to England. Similar structures existed across northern Europe, from Scandinavia to the Alps. Wherever winter was severe and livestock was central to survival, the logic of the Longhouse emerged. But the English Longhouse had its own characteristics. The use of cruck frames, for example, which were large curved timbers that rose from the ground to the roof ridge, providing both wall support and roof structure in a single piece. This created a spacious interior without the need for interior posts that would have divided the space. The roof was thatched, usually with straw or reeds. Thatch is an excellent insulator, and it sheds water effectively when laid at the correct angle. The thickness of the thatch, often a foot or more, provided a significant thermal barrier between the interior and the outside air. Smoke from the central hearth in the living area filtered up through the thatch. This had the added benefit of curing the thatch, making it more resistant to rot and pests. The interior of the Longhouse was smoky, but the smoke rose naturally, and the height of the roof meant it dispersed before becoming unbearable. In the living area, the layout was simple. The hearth was central, open on all sides. Around it, the family's possessions were arranged. Wooden chests, benches, a table if they had one. Sleeping platforms or pallets were set up near the walls or in the space closest to the hearth. There was no privacy in the modern sense. Everyone lived in the same room. Everyone slept in proximity to everyone else. This was not seen as a problem. Privacy was not a value that medieval rural people prioritised. What mattered was warmth, safety, and the ability to work together as a unit. The Longhouse was not a comfortable dwelling by modern standards. It was dark, smoky, and crowded, but it was remarkably effective at what it was designed to do. It kept people and animals alive through winters that could last 6 months. It used the biological heat of livestock as a passive heating system, requiring no fuel beyond what was needed for cooking and minimal supplemental warmth. The design of the Longhouse was not written down in architectural plans. It was vernacular architecture, meaning it emerged from the conditions of the place and the needs of the people. Each Longhouse was slightly different, adapted to the specific site, the materials available and the size of the household. But the core principles were consistent. Bring the animals inside, create a space where their heat can be shared, build thick walls and a thick roof to hold that heat. Use the cross passage to manage airflow and access. Keep the hearth central so its heat radiates in all directions. These principles were proven over generations. The Longhouse was not an experiment. It was a solution that worked, and it remained the dominant form of rural dwelling in the upland regions of England for centuries. The hearth was not just a feature of the medieval home, it was the organising principle. Everything in the household revolved around it. In most peasant dwellings, the hearth was located in the centre of the main room. It was not built against a wall. It was not enclosed in a fireplace. It was an open pit, usually lined with stone or packed clay, sitting directly on the floor or slightly raised on a platform. This central location was deliberate. It allowed the fire to radiate heat in all directions. There was no back wall absorbing half the heat output. Every side of the fire was useful. The family arranged themselves around the hearth in a rough circle. Work was done facing the fire. Meals were eaten near it. Sleep happened as close to it as was practical without risking sparks or burns. The fire burned continuously during the winter. It was not lit in the morning and extinguished at night. It was kept alive, day and night, for months. This required planning. Fuel had to be gathered and stored in quantities that seem excessive by modern standards. A household might need several cords of wood to get through a single winter. More if the winter was long or the family was large. The choice of fuel was not arbitrary. Different woods burned in different ways. Oak was prized because it was dense and burned slowly. A log of oak could smoulder for hours, producing steady heat and leaving substantial coals. Ash was also valued. It burned hot and could be burned green, meaning it did not need to be seasoned for months before use. Beech was another good option, especially for overnight burning. It produced a long-lasting ember bed that could be banked and kept alive until morning. Softwoods like pine or fir were less useful for heating. They burned too quickly and produced too much smoke. They were used for kindling, for getting a fire started, but not for sustained warmth. In areas where wood was scarce, other fuels were used. Peat, which is compressed plant matter cut from bogs, was common in wetland regions. It burned with a distinctive acrid smell and produced less heat than wood, but it was abundant and free for the taking. Dried animal dung mixed with straw was also used, particularly in treeless upland areas. It burned slowly and was surprisingly effective as a fuel source. The fire was never left unattended. Someone in the household was always responsible for it. This was not a formal role, but an understood duty. If the fire went out, it was a serious failure. Starting a fire from scratch was difficult and time-consuming. It required flint and steel, or a piece of iron pyrite struck together to create a spark. The spark had to land on tinder, usually charred cloth or very dry moss, and be nursed into a flame. The flame then had to be transferred to kindling, and the kindling to larger pieces of wood. This process could take 10 or 15 minutes, even for someone skilled. In cold, damp conditions, it could take much longer. Losing the fire meant losing warmth, losing the ability to cook, and losing valuable time. So the fire was protected, it was tended. It was fed carefully throughout the day, adding just enough wood to keep it burning without wasting fuel. The smoke from the fire was a constant presence. In the earliest medieval homes, before the introduction of chimneys, the smoke simply rose to the roof and escaped through gaps in the thatch or through a hole in the roof ridge. This filled the upper part of the room with smoke. The air near the floor was clearer, which is why furniture was low and why people often sat rather than stood when inside. Over time, chimneys became more common, even in peasant homes. But the chimney was not always central. It was often built into a wall or added as an external structure. The central hearth remained the norm in many rural areas well into the late medieval period. The heat from the fire was intense at close, range and diminished rapidly with distance. This created zones within the room. The area immediately around the hearth was warm, even hot. A few feet away the temperature dropped noticeably. Near the walls it was cold. This zoning influenced how space was used. The warmest spots were reserved for those who needed them most, the very young, the very old, the sick. Everyone else arranged themselves according to hierarchy and need, with the understanding that proximity to the fire was a privilege. At night the fire became even more critical. It was the only source of light once the rushlights were extinguished. It was the only source of heat in a room that grew colder as the hours passed, but the fire could not be allowed to burn freely through the night. That would consume too much wood and create a risk of sparks escaping and igniting the thatch or the straw bedding, so the fire was banked. This was a technique that required experience and care, and we will explore it in detail in the next chapter. For now, it is enough to understand that the hearth was the heart of the medieval home. It was where life happened. It was where the family gathered. It was the source of heat, light, and food. Without it, survival through the winter would have been impossible. The fire was tended with respect, almost reverence. It was not just a practical tool. It was the centre of the household's existence, the element that made the cold months bearable. As long as the fire burned, the household endured. Not all wood burned the same way. This was knowledge that every medieval household understood from experience. The selection of fuel began months before it would be needed. In the spring and summer, when outdoor work was possible, men and older children would venture into the woods to cut timber. Some of this was for construction or repair, but much of it was simply fuel. The best firewood came from hardwoods. Oak, ash, and beech were the preferred choices across most of England. These trees grew slowly, producing dense wood that burned with sustained heat. Oak was particularly valued. A single oak log, properly dried, could burn for hours. It produced a deep bed of coals that radiated heat long after the flames had died down. Oak coals could be banked overnight and still be glowing in the morning. Ash had different properties. It burned hotter than oak, which made it useful for cooking tasks that required intense heat. It also had the unusual quality of burning well even when green. Most woods needed to be seasoned for 6 months to a year, allowing the moisture content to drop. Ash could be cut and burned within weeks. Beech fell between oak and ash in most respects. It burned hot and steady, though not quite as hot as ash. It produced good coals, though not quite as long-lasting as oak. But it was widely available and easy to split, which made it a reliable choice. Other hardwoods were used when available. Elm, when dry, burned adequately. Birch was easy to ignite and burned with a pleasant smell, though it burned quickly, and was better suited for kindling than sustained heating. Softwoods were generally avoided for heating. Pine, fir and spruce contained resins that caused them to spit and crackle when burned. They produced more smoke and less heat than hardwoods. They burned too fast to be efficient, but softwoods had their uses. They made excellent kindling because they caught fire easily. A few sticks of pine could get a fire started when the hardwood logs were still cold. Once the fire was established, the hardwoods would take over. The wood had to be stored properly. Freshly cut wood contained too much moisture to burn efficiently. It would smoulder and smoke rather than producing clean flames and heat. Seasoning wood meant stacking it in a dry, ventilated place and leaving it for months. The stack was usually built outdoors, under an overhang or covered with thatch to keep rain off the top while allowing air to circulate through. The sides. The wood was split before stacking. Split wood dried faster than whole logs because the exposed interior could release moisture. Splitting also made the wood easier to handle and feed into the fire. By autumn, the wood stack should have been fully seasoned. A household would assess their supply carefully. Was there enough to last through the winter? If not, there was still time to gather more, though the wood cut in autumn would not be fully dry and would burn less efficiently. The amount of wood needed depended on many factors: the size of the dwelling, the severity of the winter, the size of the household, whether livestock were kept indoors adding their heat. A typical peasant household might burn a cord of wood per month during the coldest part of winter. A cord is a stack measuring 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Over a 5-month winter, that meant 5 cords or more. Gathering this much wood was labour-intensive. It required access to woodland, permission to cut, the tools to do the work, and the time to complete it. In areas where wood was scarce, fuel became a serious concern. Some regions relied on other materials. In the fenlands and marshy areas, peat was the primary fuel. Peat was cut from bogs in large rectangular blocks. These blocks were stacked and dried through the summer, turning from wet black muck into hard brown bricks. Peat burned differently than wood. It produced a steady, low heat and a distinctive smell. It did not create the same kind of flames as wood, but it formed a glowing bed that could last for hours. In areas where peat was abundant, it was the fuel of choice. In treeless upland regions, dried dung was used. Cattle and sheep dung was collected, mixed with straw and formed into cakes. These were dried in the sun and stored for winter. They burned slowly and produced a surprising amount of heat, though the smell was strong. The fire's fuel was not just a practical matter. It was also a matter of status. Wealthy households used only the finest hardwoods. Their fires burned bright and hot with minimal smoke. The quality of the wood reflected the quality of the household. Poorer households used whatever they could get. They might mix woods of different qualities, burning ash and oak when they had it, elm and birch when they did not, peat or dung when nothing else was available. But regardless of wealth, the principle was the same. The fire had to be fed. It had to be kept alive. The choice of fuel affected how often it needed tending, how much heat it produced, and how long the coals would last. By evening, when the household was preparing for the night, the fire had usually been burning for many hours. The wood from the day's burning had been reduced to coals. Fresh logs were added, chosen carefully for their burning properties. For overnight burning, dense hardwoods were preferred. These would burn slowly through the evening and into the night. The goal was to have substantial coals remaining by the time the household went to sleep, coals that could be banked and preserved until morning. The relationship between the household and its fuel supply was intimate. You knew your wood. You knew how each type burned, how long it lasted, how much smoke it produced. You planned your fire based on this knowledge, adjusting throughout the day to match your needs. This knowledge was not written down. It was learned by watching, by doing. by living with fire as a constant presence. Children learned it from their parents, who had learned it from theirs. The selection and management of firewood was one of the fundamental skills of medieval life. It was as essential as knowing how to plant crops or tend animals. Without it, the household could not function. The fire was life, and the wood was what kept it burning. As the evening deepened and the household prepared for sleep, the fire had to be managed for the night ahead. The fire could not be allowed to burn freely. That would consume too much wood and risk sending sparks into the thatch or onto the straw bedding. But the fire could not be allowed to die completely. Starting it again in the morning would waste time and effort. The solution was banking. This was a technique that preserved the fire in a dormant state, allowing it to smoulder through the night without flames or significant fuel consumption. The process began after the evening meal, when the household was settling in for the night. By this time, the fire had been burning for hours. The day's wood had been reduced to a bed of glowing coals. These coals were the key. Wood burns with flames, consuming itself quickly. Coals burn with radiant heat, lasting much longer. A good bed of coals, properly managed, could remain hot for 8 to 10 hours. The first step in banking was to consolidate the coals. Using a long iron poker or a wooden rake, the person tending the fire would gather all the coals into a compact pile in the centre of the hearth. Spreading them out would allow too much air to reach them, causing them to burn faster. Piling them together reduced the surface area exposed to oxygen. Once the coals were gathered, they were covered with ash. This was not loose, fluffy ash from recent burning. It was fine, powdery ash that had been collected and saved for this purpose. The ash was spread over the coals in a thick layer several inches deep. This layer acted as insulation. It prevented air from reaching the coals directly, which slowed the combustion. But it did not cut off oxygen completely. A small amount of air could still filter through, enough to keep the coals alive, but not enough to make them burn actively. The ash also held heat. As the coals beneath it glowed, the ash absorbed some of that heat and radiated it back. This created a stable, low-temperature environment that allowed the coals to persist without being consumed. The technique required judgment. Too little ash, and the coals would burn too fast, consumed before morning. Too much ash, and the coals would be smothered, dying out in the night. The right amount of ash created a perfect balance. The coals would glow faintly beneath their blanket, producing almost no visible light, but maintaining enough heat to be rekindled easily. In some households, a ceramic or metal cover was placed over the banked coals. This device was called a curfew, from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. The curfew was shaped like a dome or a large bowl, with small holes or vents to allow minimal airflow. The curfew provided an additional layer of protection. It shielded the coals from drafts that might fan them into flame. It also protected the surrounding area from stray sparks, though with the coals fully covered in ash, sparks were unlikely. Not all households had a curfew. They were more common in towns, where fire safety was a greater concern. In rural cottages, the ash alone was usually sufficient. The timing of banking was important. It was done late in the evening, after all other activities were complete. Once the fire was banked, there was no more light from the hearth. The household transitioned into darkness. In towns and villages, the banking of fires was sometimes regulated by law. A bell would ring at a set hour, signalling that all fires should be covered. This was a safety measure. Medieval towns were densely built, with timber structures packed close together. An uncontrolled fire could spread rapidly, destroying entire neighbourhoods. The curfew bell became a marker of the evening. When it rang, people knew it was time to prepare for sleep. The sound was a reminder that the day was ending, that the night was beginning. In the morning, the banked fire was uncovered. The ash was carefully raked away, revealing the coals beneath. If the banking had been done correctly, the coals would still be glowing faintly, giving off heat. Fresh kindling was added to the coals, small dry sticks that would catch fire easily. As the kindling ignited, larger pieces of wood were added, building the fire back up to its daytime size. This process took only a few minutes. The household went from a cold, dark room to a warm, lit space without the labour of starting a fire from scratch. If the banking had failed, If the coals had gone out during the night, the morning was much harder. Someone would have to use flint and steel to create a spark, nurse that spark into a flame, and rebuild the fire from nothing. This was seen as a failure of household management. It meant someone had not banked the fire properly. It meant the household would start the day behind, struggling to warm the room and prepare the morning meal. The fear of losing the fire was real. It was not just an inconvenience. It was a disruption of the household's rhythm, a waste of resources, and a sign of poor planning. So the fire was banked with care, every night for months. It became a ritual as ingrained as any other part of the evening routine. The person responsible for the fire knew exactly how to do it, knew how the coals should look, how much ash to use, how to check that everything was secure, and in the morning, when the ash was pulled back and the coals glowed beneath, there was a quiet satisfaction. The fire had survived the night. The household could continue. In towns, the evening was marked by sound. The curfew bell rang from the church tower or the town hall, a clear signal that echoed through the streets. The bell had a practical purpose. It told residents that it was time to cover their fires, but it also served as a communal rhythm, a shared moment that synchronized the town's transition from day to night. The origin of the curfew was safety. Medieval towns were built almost entirely of wood, timber frames, thatched roofs, wooden shutters, wooden floors. Fire was an ever-present danger. A single spark could ignite a roof. A tipped candle could set a room ablaze. An unattended hearth could send embers onto dry rushes covering the floor. Once a fire started, it spread quickly. In densely packed towns where buildings shared walls or were separated by only a narrow alley, a fire in one structure could easily jump to the next. Within hours, entire blocks could be consumed. The great fires of medieval cities are well documented. London burned multiple times. Other towns across England experienced similar disasters. The damage was catastrophic, destroying homes, businesses, churches, and leaving hundreds or thousands homeless. The curfew was one response to this risk. By requiring all fires to be covered at a set time, the authorities reduced the chance of an overnight fire spreading uncontrolled. The hour of the curfew varied by season and by town. In winter, when darkness came early, the bell might ring at 7 or 8 in the evening. In summer, it could be as late as 9 or 10. The bell was rung by the town's bell ringer, often a paid position. The ringer would climb the tower stairs at the appointed time and pull the rope, sending the bell's tone across the rooftops. The sound carried well. Even in the noisiest parts of town, the bell could be heard. It was a deep, resonant tone designed to cut through the ambient noise of daily life. When the bell rang, people responded. Fires were banked using the methods we have already discussed. Coals were gathered, covered with ash, and sometimes protected with a curfew cover. Candles were extinguished. Rushlights were put out. Anything that posed a fire risk was secured or eliminated. In some towns, officials would walk the streets after the curfew, checking that the law was being followed. Households that failed to cover their fires could be fined. Repeat offenders faced harsher penalties. This enforcement was not arbitrary. It was seen as necessary for the safety of the entire community. Your carelessness with fire could destroy your neighbour's home. The curfew was a collective responsibility. But the curfew bell was more than just a regulation. It became part of the rhythm of life. People organised their evenings around it. Meals were planned to finish before the bell. Work was completed before the bell. Children were put to bed after the bell. The bell marked a boundary. Before it rang, the town was active. After it rang, the town quieted. Streets emptied, doors were closed, shutters were fastened. The public life of the town retreated indoors. There was a psychological aspect to this transition. The bell was a signal to slow down, to prepare for rest. It created a shared pause, a moment when everyone in the town stopped and attended to the same task. In rural areas, where there was no bell, the transition was less formal but still present. People judged the time by the light, by the completion of tasks, by habit. The fire was banked when it was time to sleep, and that time was consistent from night to night. But in towns, the bell gave structure to the evening. It removed ambiguity. When the bell rang, you acted. You did not delay or question. You covered your fire and prepared for the night. The curfew bell also had a secondary effect. It reduced the amount of artificial light in the town after dark. With fires banked and candles extinguished, the streets became truly dark. This darkness was profound in a way that is difficult to imagine now. There were no streetlights, no electric signs, no glow from windows. The only light came from the moon and stars, and on cloudy nights even those were obscured. Walking through a medieval town after curfew meant navigating by memory and feel. You knew the layout of the streets, the placement of obstacles, the location of your home. You moved carefully, one hand on the wall, counting steps, listening for landmarks. Most people did not venture out after curfew unless necessary. The darkness was disorienting and potentially dangerous. Thieves operated in the dark. Streets were uneven and easy to trip on. It was safer to stay inside. So the curfew bell effectively ended the public day. After it rang, the town became a collection of isolated households, each one dark and quiet, each one waiting for the morning. Inside, the household settled into the rhythms of the night. The fire was banked. The light was gone. The temperature began to drop as the heat from the day's fire slowly dissipated. The curfew bell had done its job. The fires were covered. The risk of disaster was reduced. The town could sleep, at least for a few hours, without the fear of waking to flames. And in the morning, before dawn, the same bell would ring again. This time, it signalled that the curfew was lifted. Fires could be uncovered, rekindled, and allowed to burn freely. The day could begin. Most people in medieval England did not sleep on anything we would recognise as a mattress. What they had was the pallet. A pallet was simple in construction. It was a large sack made from coarse fabric, usually canvas or linen. The sack was filled with whatever material was available and affordable. For the majority of people, that material was straw. Straw was the dried stalks of grain crops, primarily wheat or rye. After the harvest, the grain was separated from the stalks through threshing. The grain was kept for food. The stalks were kept for many purposes, including bedding. Straw had several advantages as a filling material. It was abundant. Every farming household had access to it. It was lightweight and easy to work with, and it had good insulating properties. The structure of straw is what made it effective. Each stalk is hollow, a thin tube of plant material surrounding an airspace. When straw was packed into a sack, these hollow tubes created thousands of tiny air pockets. Air is a poor conductor of heat. The air trapped in the straw acted as a barrier between the sleeper's body and the cold surface beneath. This kept body heat from draining away into the floor. The pallet was placed directly on the floor in most peasant homes. Some households had low wooden platforms or benches that raised the pallet slightly, which provided additional insulation from the cold ground. But many slept directly on the packed earth or stone floor, with only the straw pallet between them and the cold. The thickness of the pallet varied. A well-stuffed pallet might be 6 to 8 inches thick when new. This provided adequate cushioning and insulation, but straw compresses over time. The weight of the sleeper's body gradually flattened the stalks, reducing the loft and the insulating air pockets. A pallet that had been used for several weeks or months might be only 2 or 3 inches thick. At this point it needed to be refilled. The old compressed straw was emptied out, often used as animal bedding or mixed into compost. Fresh straw was stuffed into the sack, restoring the pallet's thickness. This maintenance was part of the household routine. During the winter, when straw was in constant use, pallets might need to be refreshed every few weeks. The straw also had drawbacks. It was scratchy against bare skin. The cut ends of the stalks could poke through the fabric of the sack, creating an uncomfortable sleeping surface. To mitigate this, people placed layers of fabric over the pallet. A wool blanket or an old cloak could create a barrier between the straw and the skin. This made the pallet more comfortable and reduced the prickling sensation. Straw was also prone to moisture absorption. England's damp climate meant that humidity was a constant issue. Straw could absorb moisture from the air or from the ground, becoming damp and losing its insulating properties. A damp pallet was worse than useless. It conducted heat away from the body rather than retaining it. It also became a breeding ground for mould and unpleasant odours. To prevent this, pallets were aired regularly. On dry days, the sacks were taken outside, opened, and the straw spread out to dry in the sun and wind. This evaporated any accumulated moisture and kept the straw fresh. Straw was also attractive to pests. Fleas, lice and mites found the dark, warm environment of a straw pallet ideal. These pests were a constant nuisance in medieval households, and bedding was one of their primary habitats. There was no effective way to eliminate pests completely. Regular replacement of the straw helped reduce their numbers. Some households added herbs to the straw, such as lavender or wormwood, which were believed to repel insects. Whether this was effective is uncertain, but the herbs at least improved the smell. For wealthier peasants and the yeoman class, the pallet might be filled with something softer than straw. Wool flock, the short fibres combed from sheep, was one option. It was more expensive than straw, but much more comfortable. Wool flock did not compress as much as straw. It retained its loft better and provided superior insulation. It was also less scratchy and less prone to harbouring pests. Chaff, the husks of grain, was another alternative. It was softer than straw, but still readily available. However, chaff was even lighter than straw and tended to shift inside the pallet, creating lumps and uneven spots. Dried leaves, particularly oak or beech leaves, were used in areas where straw was scarce. They provided some insulation but compressed quickly, and broke down into dust over time. Regardless of the filling, the pallet was the foundation of sleep for most medieval people. It was not luxurious, it did not provide the comfort of a modern bed, but it was adequate. The pallet kept the sleeper off the cold floor. It provided a defined sleeping space. It could be moved if needed, rolled up during the day to clear floor space, or positioned near the hearth for maximum warmth. For children, pallets were often shared. 2 or 3 children might sleep on a single large pallet, their combined body heat helping to keep them warm. This was practical and efficient, reducing the number of pallets needed and making the most of limited resources. Adults usually had their own pallets, though spouses shared. The size of the pallet varied with the number of people using it, from small single pallets to large ones that could accommodate a couple and perhaps a young child. The pallet was humble, but it was essential. It was the difference between sleeping in relative comfort and sleeping directly on a freezing floor. For the vast majority of medieval English people, it was all they had, and it was enough. Wool was everywhere in medieval England. It was the fabric of everyday life, and in winter, it was essential for survival. Sheep were raised across the country, from the marshlands of the southeast to the hills of the north. The English climate was well suited to sheep farming, and by the medieval period, England had become one of the largest wool producers in Europe. The wool was sheared from the sheep in spring after the worst of the cold had passed, but before the heat of summer. The fleeces were processed, cleaned and carded to separate the fibres. Some of the wool was spun into yarn and woven into cloth. Some was used in its raw or semi-processed state for stuffing and insulation. What made wool remarkable was its structure. Each wool fibre is covered in tiny scales that trap air between them. This air, like the air in straw, acts as insulation. But wool has an additional property that straw does not. It retains its insulating ability even when wet. Most materials, when they become damp, lose their effectiveness as insulators. Water conducts heat much better than air, so a wet material will draw heat away from the body. Wool is different. The fibres absorb moisture into their core, while the outer scales remain relatively dry. This means wool can be damp and still provide warmth. In the context of medieval England, where dampness was constant, this property was invaluable. Wool blankets were the primary covering for sleep. A thick, wool blanket woven from coarse fibres could weigh several pounds. It was heavy, which helped it stay in place through the night. It was dense, which blocked drafts. And it was warm, even in the coldest rooms. Poorer households used blankets made from undyed, roughly woven wool. These were functional but coarse. The wool still contained its natural oils, including lanolin, which gave it a distinctive smell and made it somewhat water-resistant. Wealthier households had finer wool blankets, sometimes dyed in rich colours. These were woven from softer fibres and were more pleasant against the skin. But the principle was the same. Wool was the material of choice for staying warm. In addition to blankets, wool was used for clothing. A wool tunic or gown was worn during the day and often kept on at night. Removing clothing would expose the body to the cold, so people slept in their day clothes, adding layers if needed. Wool cloaks were common. These large rectangular pieces of fabric could be wrapped around the body during the day and used as an additional covering at night. A heavy wool cloak layered over a blanket provided substantial warmth. Nightshirts, when they were used, were also made of wool or linen. Linen was less warm than wool, but it was softer and less irritating to the skin. Some people wore a linen undershirt with a wool outer layer, combining the comfort of linen with the warmth of wool. Head coverings were important. The head was believed to be a major source of heat loss. A wool or linen cap called a coif was worn to bed. It covered the ears and tied under the chin, keeping the head warm through the night. This belief was not entirely wrong. The head does lose heat, though not as disproportionately as medieval people thought. But in a cold room, keeping the head covered made a noticeable difference to overall comfort. Children were bundled in layers of wool. Infants, who could not regulate their body temperature as effectively as adults, were wrapped tightly in wool cloth. This swaddling kept them warm and prevented them from kicking off their coverings during sleep. The maintenance of wool items was ongoing. Blankets and clothing needed to be cleaned, though not frequently. Wool is naturally resistant to dirt and odours, and overwashing could damage the fibres and remove the protective lanolin. When wool items were washed, it was done carefully. The fabric was soaked in warm water, sometimes with a mild soap made from animal fat and ash. It was gently agitated, rinsed, and then laid out to dry. Wringing or twisting wool could cause it to felt, turning the fabric into a stiff, matted mass. Wool items were also aired regularly. Hanging them outside on a breezy day helped remove odours and moisture. The sunlight had a mild bleaching effect, keeping the fabric from becoming too dingy. Repairs were common. Wool cloth could tear or wear thin, especially at points of stress like elbows or knees. These areas were patched, often with scraps from other worn-out garments. A blanket might have multiple patches, each one extending its useful life. The value of wool was recognised at every level of society. Even the poorest household had some wool, even if it was just a single threadbare blanket. Wool was not a luxury, it was a necessity. For wealthier households, wool was still important, but it was supplemented with other materials. Fur linings in cloaks and blankets added extra warmth. Silk, imported and expensive, was used for decorative elements, but the foundation was still wool. The quality of the wool varied with the breed of sheep and the processing method. Fine wool from young sheep produced soft fabric suitable for clothing that touched the skin. Coarse wool from older sheep was used for outer garments and blankets, where durability mattered more than softness. The natural colour of wool ranged from white to grey to dark brown, depending on the sheep. Undyed wool retained these natural colours, which were practical and required no additional processing. Dyed wool was a sign of wealth, as dyes were expensive and the dyeing process required skill. But whether fine or coarse, dyed or undyed, wool served the same essential function. It kept people warm. In the depth of winter, when the fire had been banked and the room was cold, wool was what made sleep possible. It was the barrier between the body and the freezing air. It was the layer that trapped body heat and held it close. Without wool, the medieval winter would have been far harsher. With it, people could sleep, rest, and wake to face another cold day. For those with wealth, sleep took on a different character. The straw pallet was replaced by the featherbed. A featherbed was exactly what the name suggests. A large fabric case, usually made of fine linen or ticking filled with feathers. Not just any feathers, but the down and soft feathers from geese or ducks. Down is the layer of fine, fluffy feathers found beneath the outer feathers of waterfowl. It has no central shaft, only a cluster of soft interlocking filaments. These filaments create thousands of tiny air pockets, giving down exceptional insulating properties relative to its weight. A featherbed was not a thin layer. It was often 8 to 12 inches thick when new, creating a soft, yielding surface that conformed to the body. Sleeping on a featherbed was a completely different experience from sleeping on straw. The construction of a featherbed required significant labour and resources. First, the feathers had to be collected. Geese were plucked during the molting season, when they naturally shed their feathers. This could be done without harming the birds, though it was time-consuming work. The feathers were cleaned, dried, and sorted. The softest down was separated from the larger feathers. Down was more valuable and more effective as filling, but larger feathers were also used, especially in less expensive feather beds. The fabric case had to be tightly woven to prevent the feathers from poking through. A loosely woven fabric would allow the sharp quills of feathers to escape, creating an uncomfortable and wasteful situation. Once filled and sealed, the featherbed became one of the most valuable possessions in the household. In inventories and wills from the medieval period, featherbeds are frequently listed and carefully accounted for. They were passed down from generation to generation, often specifically bequeathed to particular family members. The value was not just monetary, though featherbeds were expensive, it was also cultural. A featherbed signified comfort, status, and care for one's well-being. It was a marker of having reached a level of prosperity that allowed for such refinement. The featherbed was placed on a wooden bed frame. Unlike the pallet, which sat on the floor, the featherbed was elevated. This served multiple purposes. First, elevation provided additional insulation from the cold floor. Air could circulate beneath the bed, creating a buffer zone. Second, it made getting in and out of bed easier, especially for older or infirm members of the household. Third, it was a status symbol. A raised bed, particularly one with posts and a canopy, announced the owner's wealth. The featherbed required maintenance. Over time, the feathers would shift and settle, creating uneven areas. The bed needed to be shaken and fluffed regularly to redistribute the filling. Feathers could also become compressed, though not as severely as straw. The natural resilience of down meant that a well-made featherbed could maintain its loft for years, even decades. Moisture was less of a problem with feathers than with straw. Feathers shed water naturally due to the oils from the bird's plumage, but prolonged dampness could still cause problems, including unpleasant odours and the degradation of the fabric case. On dry days, featherbeds were aired. The fabric was opened slightly, and the bed was left in the sun and breeze. This evaporated any accumulated moisture and kept the filling fresh. Pests were a concern, though less so than with straw. Feathers were not as attractive to insects as plant material. But mice and rats, if they gained access, could burrow into a featherbed and create nests. Keeping the bed elevated and the room clean helped prevent this. The softness of the featherbed was both a luxury and a potential issue. For people accustomed to sleeping on firm surfaces, the yielding nature of a featherbed could feel unstable. There are accounts of people preferring a firmer mattress, even when a featherbed was available. But for most, the featherbed represented the ideal. It was warm, comfortable, and a tangible sign of success. To own a featherbed was to have transcended the basic struggle for survival. It was to have achieved a level of comfort that the majority of the population could only imagine. In noble households, the bed was the centerpiece of the private chamber. It was often the most expensive single item in the room, surpassing even fine furniture or tapestries in value. The featherbed was paired with additional layers. Linen sheets were placed over the feathers, creating a smooth surface against the skin. Wool blankets or quilts provided additional warmth. In the wealthiest homes, fur coverlets were added, using the pelts of expensive animals like ermine or fox. The entire assembly became a cocoon of warmth and softness, a stark contrast to the cold stone walls of the chamber. Inside this bed, even in the depths of winter, sleep could be genuinely comfortable. But featherbeds were rare. The vast majority of people never slept on one. They were confined to the upper classes and the wealthier merchants. For most, the featherbed remained an aspiration, something spoken of but never experienced. Still, the existence of the featherbed shaped the understanding of what sleep could be. It represented the potential for comfort, the possibility that rest did not have to be a mere cessation of activity, but could be a pleasant, restorative experience. And for those who owned them, featherbeds were cherished. They were maintained with care, protected from damage, and passed down as treasured heirlooms. In a world where comfort was scarce, the featherbed was a refuge. In the great stone halls of the manor houses and castles, heat was nearly impossible to retain. Stone walls absorbed cold and radiated it inward. High ceilings allowed warmth to rise and dissipate. Even with fires blazing in massive hearths, the edges of the room remained freezing. The solution, for those who could afford it, was the curtained bed. This was not simply a bed with decorative fabric. It was an architectural structure within the room, designed to create a separate, enclosed space that could be warmed by body heat alone. The frame was substantial. 4 posts rose from the corners of the bed frame, often reaching 6 or 7 feet high. Across the top, a canopy called a tester was fixed, creating a roof for the bed. From this frame, heavy curtains were hung on all 4 sides. These curtains were made of wool, thick linen, or in wealthier households, velvet or brocade. They could be drawn closed completely, enclosing the sleeper in a small, dark chamber. The principle was simple. The human body generates heat constantly through metabolic processes. In an open room, this heat dissipates into the surrounding air, carried away by draughts and absorbed by cold surfaces. Inside the curtained bed, with the fabric drawn closed, the body's heat had nowhere to go. It was trapped within the small volume of air inside the curtains. Over time, this air warmed to a temperature significantly higher than the room outside. The effect was similar to a modern sleeping bag or tent. The enclosed space became its own microclimate, warmed by the occupant, insulated from the exterior cold by the layers of fabric. The curtains also blocked drafts. Medieval buildings, even well-built ones, were not airtight. Cold air leaked through gaps around windows, under doors, through cracks in the walls. These drafts were a constant source of heat loss. By creating a barrier around the bed, the curtains stopped these drafts from reaching the sleeper directly. The air inside the bed remained still, which enhanced the insulating effect. The fabric of the curtains mattered. Wool was the most effective because of its insulating properties. Heavy wool curtains, tightly woven, blocked both air movement and radiant heat loss. Lighter fabrics such as linen were less effective but still better than nothing. In summer, lighter curtains might be used for privacy and to keep out insects, while in winter they were replaced with heavier materials. The curtains were often lined. A wool outer layer might be backed with linen, combining the insulation of wool with the smoother texture of linen on the interior. Some curtains were quilted with layers of fabric stitched together, with padding in between, further increasing their thermal performance. The bed itself was placed strategically within the room. Ideally, it was positioned away from exterior walls, which were the coldest surfaces. It might be placed near an interior wall, or even in a recessed alcove if the architecture allowed. In some chambers, the bed was the only furniture. The room functioned solely as a sleeping space, with other activities taking place in different areas of the house. This allowed the chamber to remain relatively dark and quiet, dedicated to rest. Getting into the curtained bed required a deliberate transition. You approached the bed, parted the curtains, climbed onto the high frame, and then pulled the curtains closed behind you. It was like entering a separate room. Inside, the darkness was complete when the curtains were fully drawn. No light penetrated the heavy fabric. This darkness was intentional. It signaled to the body that it was time to sleep, free from the distractions of the visible world. The air inside the bed could become stuffy, especially if more than one person was sleeping. 2 or 3 people in a curtained bed generated considerable heat and consumed oxygen. The curtains were not sealed at the bottom, allowing some air exchange with the room, but ventilation was limited. This stuffiness was generally tolerated. The warmth it represented was more valuable than fresh air. People were accustomed to enclosed, smoky environments, and the air inside a curtained bed was mild by comparison. In the morning, the curtains were opened. The rush of cold air from the room was a shock, a reminder of the temperature difference that the curtains had been maintaining. Getting out of the warm bed and into the cold chamber required effort and resolve. For this reason, people often delayed rising. Once awake, they might remain inside the curtained bed for a time, talking, praying, or simply postponing the inevitable cold. In households with servants, the servant might enter the chamber and open the curtains, sometimes bringing a warming drink or lighting a fire in the chamber's hearth before the master or mistress rose. The curtained bed was a luxury, but it was not rare among the nobility and wealthier merchants. It was a standard feature of any substantial household by the later medieval period. For those who slept in curtained beds, the experience of winter sleep was fundamentally different from that of the peasantry. The cold was still present, still a factor in daily life, but during the hours of sleep it could be almost entirely excluded. Inside the fabric walls, the sleeper existed in a pocket of warmth. The bed became a refuge, not just from the cold, but from the larger world. It was a private space, a place where vulnerability was protected. This sense of enclosure, of being held and sheltered, may have contributed to the quality of sleep. The darkness, the warmth, the stillness of the air, all of these created conditions conducive to deep rest. The curtained bed was not just a piece of furniture, it was a technology, a carefully designed system for maintaining warmth and comfort in an environment that offered neither. The structure of sleep in medieval England was different from what most people experience today. The night was not a single, uninterrupted block of rest. It was divided. This pattern is called segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep. It was the norm for much of human history, only changing with the widespread adoption of artificial lighting in the modern era. The household retired to bed shortly after dark. In winter, this might be as early as 6 or 7 in the evening. There was little reason to stay awake once the fire was banked and the light was gone. The transition to sleep was not prolonged. People were tired from the day's labour. The darkness and the cold encouraged rest. Within a short time of lying down, the first sleep began. This first sleep lasted approximately 4 hours. It was a deep, restorative period of rest. Dreams were common during this phase, and they were often vivid. Medieval people considered dreams from the first sleep to be significant, sometimes prophetic. Around midnight, or perhaps 1 in the morning, people woke naturally. This was not a disturbance or a sign of insomnia. It was an expected part of the sleep cycle. The waking was gentle. There was no alarm, no sudden jolt. The sleeper simply became aware, emerging from sleep into quiet wakefulness. What happened during this interval varied. Some people remained in bed, lying in the darkness, thinking or praying. The mind was often clear and reflective during this time, free from the distractions of the day. Others rose from bed and attended to tasks. The fire needed to be checked. If the coals were burning too fast or too slow, adjustments were made. Fresh wood might be added, or the ash covering rearranged. In households with livestock, someone might go to the ship on to check on the animals. A cow in labour needed attention. A sick animal required care. These tasks could not wait until morning. Some people used the interval for prayer. The night prayers, known as vigils or matins in monastic practice, were said during these hours. Lay people adopted simpler versions, reciting familiar prayers or simply offering quiet devotion. Others engaged in conversation. Spouses might talk in low voices, discussing the events of the day or the work to come. Neighbours, if they lived close enough, might visit, moving through the dark streets to share a quiet hour by a friend's hearth. Intimacy between spouses was common during this interval. The privacy of the night, the warmth of the bed, the relaxed state of waking. All of these created natural opportunity for physical affection. The interval was also used for light work. Tasks that required focus but not intense labour were suited to this time. Brewing, for example, benefited from the quiet and the lack of interruption. Mending or sorting could be done by the dim light of the fire. Some people ate during the midnight interval. A small meal, perhaps leftover pottage or bread, helped sustain the body through the rest of the night. This was not a full meal, just a modest intake to quiet hunger. The duration of the interval varied, but it typically lasted an hour or more. There was no rush. The night was long, and there was time for this quiet waking before returning to sleep. The interval was not stressful. There was no anxiety about being awake in the middle of the night. It was expected, normal, part of the rhythm of life. Eventually, the body signalled readiness to return to sleep. The tasks were complete. The prayers said, the conversation finished. The person returned to bed, pulled the coverings close, and settled back into rest. The transition to the second sleep was usually smooth. The body, already warm and relaxed, slipped back into unconsciousness without difficulty. This pattern was so ingrained that people did not think about it. It was simply how sleep worked. The idea of sleeping through the entire night without waking would have seemed strange, even unnatural. The practice of segmented sleep was supported by the environment. Without artificial light, there was no way to extend the evening artificially. The darkness imposed a structure that the body followed. The medieval understanding of time also reinforced this pattern. Time was not measured in precise hours the way it is now. It was measured by events, by the position of the sun or stars, by the ringing of bells. The interval between the first and second sleep was marked by its own quality. It was a threshold time, neither fully day nor fully night. It existed outside the normal flow of activity. This in-between time was valued. It offered a space for reflection that the busy daylight hours did not allow. It was a time when the mind could wander, when thoughts could settle, when the inner life could be attended to. For those who experienced it, segmented sleep was not a disruption. It was a natural rhythm, as natural as the cycle of the seasons or the rising and setting of the sun. Modern research into sleep has rediscovered this pattern. Studies of people living without artificial light have shown that they spontaneously adopt segmented sleep. The body, when freed from the influence of electric lighting, returns to this older rhythm. For medieval people, this was not a curiosity or an experiment. It was simply how they slept. And during the long winter nights, when the darkness stretched for 14 or 15 hours, the pattern of 2 sleeps fit perfectly into the available time. The hour between the first and second sleep had its own character. It was quiet, unhurried, and often solitary. The household was dark. The fire had been banked hours earlier, leaving only a faint glow from the embers beneath the ash. No rushlights burned. The only light, if any, came from the moon filtering through cracks in the shutters. In this darkness, small sounds became noticeable. The settling of timbers as they contracted in the cold, the breathing of others in the room, the occasional movement of an animal in the shippon. These sounds were not disturbing. They were familiar, part of the texture of the night. For many, the interval was spent lying in bed, awake but still. The body remained warm beneath the wool coverings. Moving required effort and brought exposure to the cold air outside the bedding, so people lay still and let their minds wander. Thoughts drifted without direction. Memories surfaced. Plans for the coming day formed loosely, without the pressure of immediate action. This state of mind was different from daytime thinking. It was slower, more associative. Ideas connected in unexpected ways. Problems that had seemed intractable during the day sometimes resolved themselves during this quiet hour. For those who rose during the interval, the first task was often the fire. The person responsible would slip out of bed, moving carefully to avoid disturbing others. The floor was cold against bare feet. Most people kept a pair of simple shoes or thick wool socks near the bed to protect against the chill. At the hearth, the ash covering the coals was gently pulled back with a poker or stick. If the coals were still glowing, the banking had been successful. A few small sticks of kindling were added, and the person would blow gently on the coals to encourage them to catch. Within a few minutes, a small flame appeared. It was not a large fire, just enough to provide light and a modest amount of heat. This fire would not be maintained for long, only until the tasks of the interval were complete. The light from this small fire illuminated the room dimly. Shadows moved on the walls. The shapes of furniture and sleeping forms became visible. If someone needed to leave the house during the interval, they did so with caution. The outside was profoundly dark. Clouds often obscured the moon and stars. The ground was uneven, frozen, and potentially slippery. A small lantern might be carried, with a candle or a piece of burning wood inside. This provided just enough light to see a few steps ahead. But fuel was precious, and such outings were kept brief. Checking the livestock was a common reason to venture out. In the byre dwelling or longhouse, this required only moving to the adjacent room. In households where animals were kept in a separate building, it meant crossing the yard. The animals were usually quiet at this hour, resting but alert. A soft word or a touch reassured them. If an animal was in distress, it was attended to immediately. Delaying until morning could mean the loss of valuable livestock. Water for the animals was checked. In freezing temperatures, water could ice over within hours. Breaking the ice and ensuring the animals could drink was essential. For those who remained indoors, the interval offered opportunities for personal devotion. Prayer was a central part of medieval life, and the quiet of the midnight hour was considered particularly suitable for communion with the divine. Simple prayers were common: the Paternoster, the Ave Maria, the Credo. These were known by heart and could be recited in the darkness without need for a book. Some households had prayer books or psalters, but these required light to read. More often, the prayers were oral, passed down through generations, recited from memory. The act of praying during the night was seen as a discipline, a way of maintaining spiritual vigilance. The darkness was associated with spiritual danger, and prayer was a form of protection. Beyond the practical and the spiritual, the interval was also social in a quiet way. If two people were awake, they might talk. The conversation was low, almost whispered, so as not to wake others. These conversations were often intimate. The darkness and the stillness created a sense of privacy, even in a shared room. Topics that might not be discussed during the busy day could be explored in these quiet hours. Elderly members of the household often woke during the interval and remained awake longer than others. For them, sleep was lighter and more fragmented. The interval gave them time to adjust their position, ease stiff joints, or simply lie awake without the expectation of immediate sleep. Children, by contrast, usually slept through the interval without waking. Their sleep was deeper, and they did not yet follow the segmented pattern of adults. As the interval drew to a close, the small fire was allowed to die back. The coals were covered again if necessary. The person who had risen returned to bed. The transition back to sleep was usually smooth. The body was still tired, and the hour spent awake had not fully dispelled the need for rest. Within a short time, the second sleep began. This second sleep would last until dawn, or slightly before. It was often lighter than the first sleep, with more frequent shifts in position and more awareness of the external environment. But it was still restorative. By the time morning came, the body had received the rest it needed, divided into two portions with a quiet interval between. The midnight watch, as this interval came to be known, was a natural part of the rhythm of pre-industrial life. It was not seen as unusual or problematic. It was simply the way people slept when the night was long and the darkness complete. After the interval of waking, the household settled back into rest. The second sleep began. This phase of sleep was different from the first. It was generally lighter, less dominated by deep, dreamless rest. The body had already completed much of its restorative work during the first sleep. The second sleep was more prone to dreams. These dreams were often less vivid than those of the first sleep, more fragmentary and fleeting. They came and went without leaving strong impressions. The sleeper was also more aware of the external environment during the second sleep. Small sounds that would have gone unnoticed during the first sleep might register. A door creaking, a gust of wind against the shutters, the call of an animal. This lighter sleep had a function. It allowed the sleeper to respond if something required attention. A fire that reignited unexpectedly, a child crying, an animal in distress. These could all penetrate the second sleep and bring the person to wakefulness. The body's position shifted more frequently during this phase. A limb that had become cramped was moved. The coverings were adjusted if they had slipped. The sleeper turned from side to side, seeking comfort. The temperature in the room continued to drop as the night progressed. The heat stored in the walls and floor from the day's fire gradually dissipated. The banked coals provided minimal warmth, just enough to keep the air from becoming truly frigid. By the early morning hours, the coldest part of the night, the room could be significantly colder than it had been at bedtime. This cold was felt even through layers of wool and the insulation of the bedding. The body compensated by curling inward, reducing the surface area exposed to the cold air. Knees were drawn up toward the chest, arms were tucked close, the head was pulled under the coverings, leaving only a small opening for breathing. In shared beds, people moved closer together during these hours. The combined body heat of 2 or 3 people created a warmer zone in the centre of the bed. This instinctive movement toward warmth was unconscious, happening during sleep without deliberate intent. Children, if they were sleeping with adults, benefited from this shared warmth. Their smaller bodies had less thermal mass and lost heat more quickly. Nestled against an adult, they stayed warm through the coldest hours. The second sleep lasted until dawn, or shortly before. The exact time of waking varied with the season. In midwinter, when dawn came late, the second sleep might extend until 7 or 8 in the morning. The transition from sleep to wakefulness was gradual. There was no alarm clock, no sudden interruption. The body woke when it was ready, or when external cues signalled that the night was ending. One such cue was the change in the quality of the darkness. Even with shuttered windows, the first light of dawn was perceptible. The absolute blackness of the night gave way to a faint, diffuse greyness. Another cue was sound. Roosters crowed at first light. Dogs began to stir. In towns, the church bells rang for morning prayers, signalling the start of the day. Inside the household, someone usually woke first. This was often an adult with responsibilities, someone who needed to rekindle the fire and prepare for the day's work. This person would slip out of bed carefully, trying not to disturb others who might still be sleeping. The cold air was a shock after the warmth of the bedding, but it was also a clear signal that the night was over. At the hearth, the process of rekindling the fire began. The ash covering the banked coals was raked away. If all had gone well, the coals beneath were still glowing faintly, giving off heat. Kindling was placed on the coals, small dry sticks that would catch easily. The person tending the fire would blow gently on the coals, adding oxygen to encourage combustion. Within moments, the kindling ignited. Flames appeared, small at first but growing quickly. Larger pieces of wood were added, building the fire back to its full size. As the fire grew, the room began to warm. The light from the flames pushed back the darkness. The household stirred, responding to the warmth and light. Others rose from their beds, one by one. The day was beginning, and there was work to be done. The second sleep ended not with a definitive moment, but with a transition. Sleep gave way to drowsy wakefulness, which gave way to full alertness as the fire warmed the room and the demands of the day asserted themselves. For those who had slept well, the night felt complete. The 2 periods of sleep, separated by the quiet interval, had provided the rest the body needed. There was no sense of sleep deprivation, no grogginess that lingered into the morning. This pattern had served the household through the night. It had allowed for the fire to be tended, for prayers to be said, for the body to rest in stages that matched the long darkness of winter. The second sleep was the final phase of this cycle, the bridge between the night and the day. When it ended, the household returned to the rhythm of work, of activity, of life in the cold light of the winter morning. The medieval understanding of the body was based on the theory of the 4 humours. This theory, inherited from ancient Greek medicine, held that health depended on the balance of 4 fluids within the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour was associated with a pair of qualities. Blood was hot and moist, phlegm was cold and moist, yellow bile was hot and dry, black bile was cold and dry. The seasons also had humoral qualities. Winter was cold and moist, the season of phlegm. This meant that winter naturally encouraged the production of phlegm in the body, leading to colds, coughs, and sluggishness. To maintain health during winter, one had to counteract these qualities. The body needed to be warmed and dried. This was accomplished through diet, through the consumption of foods and drinks that were classified as hot and dry. The classification of foods was not based on their actual temperature or moisture content. It was based on their perceived effect on the body. Certain foods were believed to generate heat internally, to stimulate circulation, to thin the blood. Spices were particularly valued for their warming properties: ginger, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These were all considered hot and dry. They were believed to fire the blood to drive out cold and dampness from the body. These spices were expensive. They came from distant lands, transported across vast distances by merchants. For the wealthy, they were used liberally. For the poor, they were used sparingly, reserved for times when their medicinal properties were most needed. One common way to incorporate warming spices was through pottage. This thick stew was the staple of the winter diet, eaten daily by most of the population. Pottage was made in a large pot suspended over the fire. The base was usually grain, barley or oats, cooked with water or, if available, broth. To this were added whatever vegetables were available: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, parsnips. If the household had meat, small pieces were added. Salt pork, bacon, or dried fish were common. Fresh meat was rare in winter, as animals were not typically slaughtered during the cold months unless necessary. The pottage was seasoned with salt and crucially with warming spices. Even a small amount of ginger or pepper could transform the dish, adding not just flavour but the perceived heat that the body needed. The pot of pottage often simmered for hours, with ingredients added as the day progressed. By evening it was thick and hearty, providing both nourishment and warmth. Eating hot food was itself a way of warming the body. The heat from the pottage transferred to the stomach, and from there it was believed to spread through the system. A bowl of steaming pottage before bed was thought to prepare the body for the cold night ahead. Bread was another staple, though it was less warming than pottage. Bread made from wheat was preferred, but barley or rye bread was more common among the peasantry. The bread was often stale by winter, as it was baked in large batches and stored. Stale bread was not wasted. It was broken into pieces and added to pottage, where it absorbed the liquid and added bulk to the meal. Or it was dipped in ale or milk to soften it before eating. Root vegetables were essential for winter survival. They could be stored for months in root cellars or pits, remaining edible long after the harvest. Turnips, carrots, parsnips and onions were all staples. These vegetables were considered moderately warming, particularly onions and leeks. They were used generously in pottage and other dishes, both for their flavour and their humoral properties. Dried legumes, peas, beans, lentils were also important. They provided protein and bulk, and they stored well. They were cooked into thick porridges or added to pottage. The wealthy had access to a broader range of foods. Fresh meat was more common, though still not daily. Game birds, venison and pork were served, often roasted or made into pies. Meat was considered warming, particularly if it was from hot-blooded animals like chickens or pigeons. Cold-blooded animals, such as fish, were less warming and were often avoided in the depths of winter except on fast days when meat was forbidden by religious law. For the wealthy, meals were often accompanied by sauces made with warming spices. A simple meat dish might be served with a sauce of ginger, cinnamon and wine, designed to enhance both flavour and the warming effect. Fruits were largely absent from the winter diet. Most fruits were seasonal and did not keep well. Dried fruits, apples, pears, plums were available but not abundant. They were considered moderately warming and were sometimes stewed with spices. Honey was used as a sweetener and was considered warming. It was added to drinks, to sauces, and sometimes eaten directly for its supposed medicinal benefits. The diet was repetitive. The same foods appeared day after day with little variation. But this repetition was not seen as a hardship. It was simply the reality of winter, when fresh ingredients were unavailable and preserved foods dominated. The goal of the winter diet was not pleasure or variety, it was survival and health. The foods consumed were chosen for their ability to sustain the body, to provide energy, and to counteract the cold and damp qualities of the season. This dietary strategy was based on centuries of accumulated knowledge. People knew which foods made them feel warmer, which gave them energy, which seemed to prevent illness. They did not understand the biochemical mechanisms, but they understood the results. And so, through the long winter months, the diet remained focused on warming the blood, on maintaining the internal fire that kept the body functioning in the face of external cold. As the household prepared for sleep, one final step remained for those who could afford it: the warming drink. This was not water. Water was cold, even when heated, and was considered harmful to drink in large quantities during winter. It was believed to increase the cold and moist humours, weakening the body. Instead, the drink was ale, beer, or for the wealthy, wine. These were fermented beverages considered warming by their nature. The alcohol they contained was believed to heat the blood and drive circulation, but the drink was not consumed plain. It was spiced and heated, transformed into a medicinal preparation designed to prepare the body for the cold night ahead. For the common folk, the drink was often a posset. This was made by heating ale or beer and adding milk. The mixture was brought nearly to a boil, then spices were added: ginger, nutmeg, cinnamon if available. The heat and the acidity of the ale caused the milk to curdle slightly, creating a thick, creamy texture. The result was a warm, filling drink that combined the warming properties of alcohol, milk and spices. A posset was substantial. It was not just a drink, but almost a light meal. It provided calories, warmth, and the comfort of something hot in the stomach before lying down in a cold bed. For the wealthy, the preferred drink was hippocras. This was spiced wine, named after the ancient physician Hippocrates, though there is no evidence he actually created or recommended such a drink. Hippocras was made by infusing wine with a mixture of spices and sweeteners. The exact recipe varied, but common ingredients included ginger, cinnamon, cloves, grains of paradise, nutmeg, and sugar. The spices were often ground together into a powder, which was then mixed with the wine. The mixture was allowed to steep for a time, sometimes hours, to extract the flavours and properties of the spices. Before serving, the hippocras was strained through cloth to remove the spice particles, leaving a clear aromatic liquid. It was served warm, heated gently to enhance its effect. The taste of hippocras was intense. The spices were strong, and the sweetness from the sugar or honey balanced their heat. It was a complex flavour, nothing like plain wine. The effect was immediate. The alcohol provided a warmth that spread through the chest and limbs. The spices stimulated the circulation, creating a sensation of heat that persisted, even after the drink was finished. Hippocras was expensive. The wine itself was costly, and the spices even more so. A single serving of hippocras might contain more spice than a peasant household used in a week. But for those who could afford it, hippocras was a nightly ritual during winter. It was the final act before retiring to bed, the culmination of the evening's preparation for sleep. The drink was consumed slowly, sipped rather than gulped. This allowed the warmth to build gradually, preparing the body for the transition from the heated space near the fire to the colder area where the bed was located. In some households, the drink was prepared by a servant and brought to the bedchamber. The master or mistress would drink it while sitting on the edge of the bed, already in their nightclothes, moments before pulling the curtains closed and settling in for the night. Children rarely received spiced drinks. The alcohol content was considered unsuitable for them, and the strong spices were thought to be too heating for their young constitutions. Instead, they might be given warm milk, perhaps lightly sweetened with honey. The sick or elderly were often given special preparations. A posset made with additional eggs was thought to be strengthening. A drink made with Malmsey wine, a sweet variety, was considered particularly restorative. The warming drink served both physical and psychological functions. Physically, it delivered warmth and calories. The alcohol dilated blood vessels, increasing circulation to the extremities. The spices were believed to stimulate internal heat production. Psychologically, the drink was a signal. It marked the end of the waking day. After the drink was consumed, there was nothing left to do but sleep. It created a boundary, a transition point between activity and rest. The ritual of preparing and consuming the drink also had value. It required a few minutes of focused attention, a slowing down that helped the mind shift away from the concerns of the day. For those who did not have access to ale, beer, or wine, other warming drinks were prepared. Hot water infused with herbs, chamomile, mint, elderflower, provided some warmth and was considered soothing, if not particularly heating. Broth, if available, was another option. The liquid left from cooking meat or bones was saved and reheated. It provided warmth and a small amount of nourishment. But for most people, the warming drink was a simple posset or a heated ale, perhaps with a pinch of whatever spice could be spared. It was not elaborate, but it was effective. The goal was always the same, to enter sleep with the body's internal furnace stoked, with circulation strong, with the cold held at bay long enough to fall asleep before the warmth dissipated. And so, as the last light faded and the fire was banked, the warming drink was consumed. The cup was set aside. The bed was approached. The long night of winter sleep began, once the warming drink was finished and the fire banked. The household needed a light for the final preparations before sleep. This light came from the Rushlight. The Rushlight was a simple device, but it was nearly universal among the common people of medieval England. It was inexpensive to make, required only materials that were freely available, and provided adequate light for basic tasks. The Rushlight was made from the soft rush, a plant that grew abundantly in damp areas throughout England. The scientific name is Juncus effusus, though medieval people simply called it rush or soft rush. The plant's stem is filled with a white spongy pith. This pith, when dried, is highly flammable and burns slowly and steadily. To make a rushlight, the outer green skin of the rush was peeled away. This was done carefully, leaving a thin strip of the outer skin intact. This strip provided structural support, preventing the pith from crumbling. The peeled rush was then dried. This could take several days, depending on the weather. The rushes were spread out in a warm, dry place, often near the hearth. Once dry, the rush pith was ready to be dipped in fat. This was usually tallow, rendered from sheep or cattle fat. The tallow was melted in a pan, and the dried rush was drawn through the liquid fat, coating it thoroughly. The rush was then allowed to cool and harden. This process was repeated several times, building up layers of fat on the pith. The more fat absorbed, the longer the rushlight would burn. A well-made rushlight, about 28 inches long, could burn for nearly an hour. The light it produced was clear and steady, better than a poorly made tallow candle. The rushlight was held in a simple holder, usually made of iron. The holder gripped the rush at an angle, allowing the fat to melt and feed the flame without dripping excessively. The flame of a rushlight was small but sufficient. It illuminated the immediate area, enough to see what you were doing, but not enough to light an entire room. This limited light was intentional. The goal was not to replicate daylight, but to provide just enough visibility to complete necessary tasks. Using more light would waste resources. Rushlights were used sparingly. They were lit only when needed and extinguished as soon as the task was complete. The household moved efficiently in the dim light, guided by familiarity with the space. The smell of a burning rushlight was distinctive. The tallow produced a slightly acrid odour, not unpleasant, but noticeable. It was part of the sensory environment of the medieval evening. The light from a rushlight was warm in colour, a yellow-orange glow that created deep shadows. The flickering of the flame gave the room a sense of movement, even when everything was still. In wealthier households, candles were used instead of rushlights. Tallow candles were an improvement over rushlights. They burned longer and produced more light, but they were also more expensive. Beeswax candles were the highest. Quality. They burned with a bright, clean flame and produced a pleasant honey scent. But beeswax was expensive, reserved for churches and the households of the nobility. For most people, the rushlight was what they had. It was adequate, and that was enough. The process of extinguishing the rushlight was simple. The flame was blown out or pinched between dampened fingers. The holder was set aside, ready for the next night. With the rushlight extinguished, the room fell into darkness. The only remaining light came from the faint glow of the banked fire, barely visible through the ash that covered it. This darkness was complete. Modern people, accustomed to streetlights, digital clocks, and the ambient glow of electronics, rarely experienced true darkness. Medieval people knew it every night. The darkness was not frightening, at least not in familiar surroundings. It was expected. The household knew the layout of the room, the location of furniture, the path to the bed. Moving in the dark was a matter of habit. But the darkness did carry a psychological weight. It was associated with vulnerability, with the unknown, with the unseen world of spirits and dangers. This is why the evening prayers were important. They provided reassurance, a sense of protection in the face of the dark. The prayers were not just religious observance. They were also a way of managing the anxiety that darkness could bring. The transition from light to darkness was the final step in the evening routine. Once the rushlight was out, there was nothing left to do but sleep. The body, already tired, welcomed the darkness as a signal to rest. In the darkness, the other senses became more acute. The sound of breathing, the rustle of straw in the pallet, the creak of the wooden bed frame. All of these were more noticeable without sight to distract. The darkness also enhanced the sense of enclosure. Inside the curtained bed, or under the wool blankets, the world contracted to the small space occupied by the body. Everything outside that space became remote, almost unreal. This sense of enclosure was comforting. It created a feeling of safety, of being sheltered and protected. The darkness, rather than being a threat, became a cocoon. And so, as the rushlight was extinguished and the darkness settled over the household, sleep came. The long night stretched ahead, measured not in hours but in the rhythm of breathing, the cycle of sleep and waking, the slow passage toward dawn. The medieval night was not just physically dark, it was also spiritually uncertain. The hours of darkness were believed to be a time when the boundary between the natural and supernatural world became thin. This was not superstition in the sense of irrational fear. It was part of the worldview, the way people understood the structure of reality. The night was a time when demons, spirits, and other unseen forces were active. To sleep safely required protection. This protection came in several forms: prayers, rituals, physical objects, and adherence to certain practices. The most important protection was prayer. The evening prayers, known as compline in the monastic tradition, were adapted by laypeople into simpler forms. The core of these prayers was a request for safety through the night. The opening line of compline, translated from Latin, was, "May the Lord Almighty grant us a peaceful night and a perfect end." This prayer acknowledged the vulnerability of sleep. To sleep was to be unconscious, unaware, unable to defend oneself. The prayer asked for divine protection during this vulnerable state. Other prayers followed, including psalms and specific invocations. The prayers asked for protection from nightmares, from sudden death, from evil spirits, and from the various dangers that the night might bring. Even those who could not read or recite formal prayers knew simpler versions. The Paternoster, the Our Father, was known by everyone. It was recited before sleep as a baseline. Protection. Physical objects also played a role. Holy water, blessed by a priest, was kept in small containers in many households. A few drops might be sprinkled on the bed or around the sleeping area as a protective barrier. Amulets and charms were common, though the church officially discouraged their use as bordering on pagan practice. Still, many people carried small objects: a piece of blessed bread, a scrap of cloth that had touched a saint's relic, a small cross, believing they offered protection. The warming stones used at the foot of the bed sometimes served a dual purpose. These were river stones or bricks heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth. They provided physical warmth, but they were also sometimes blessed or marked with a cross, giving them a protective function. The head was considered particularly vulnerable during sleep. It was believed to be the seat of reason and the soul, and therefore a target for malevolent forces. Keeping the head covered was not just about physical warmth, it was also about spiritual protection. Nightcaps, or coifs, were worn by most people. These were tight-fitting linen or wool caps that covered the head and ears. They tied under the chin, ensuring they stayed in place through the night. The practice of covering the head was so ingrained that sleeping with an uncovered head was considered dangerous. It left one open to bad dreams, to the intrusion of corrupt air, and to spiritual attack. Bed curtains, when available, also served a protective function. They created a physical barrier around the sleeper, a boundary that was believed to offer some defence against nocturnal dangers. The act of closing the curtains around the bed was almost ritualistic. It marked the creation of a safe space, a small sanctuary within the larger room. Children were taught to pray before sleep from an early age. The prayers were simple, often just a few lines asking for God's protection and the intercession of guardian angels. The concept of the guardian angel was central to medieval spirituality. Each person was believed to have an angel assigned to watch over them. At night, when other protections were weakest, the guardian angel's role became crucial. Some households had specific rituals for the night. A candle might be briefly lit and then extinguished while reciting a prayer. A sign of the cross might be made over the bed. These small acts provided reassurance. The fear of the night was not constant or overwhelming. Most nights passed without incident, but the potential for danger was always present in the background, a quiet awareness that shaped the evening routine. Nightmares were taken seriously. They were not seen as mere products of an overactive imagination. They were interpreted as messages, warnings, or attacks from spiritual forces. A particularly vivid or disturbing nightmare might prompt additional prayers the following night, or a visit to the local priest for advice and blessing. Sleep paralysis, a phenomenon where a person wakes but cannot move, was especially frightening. It was often interpreted as an attack by a night demon, or a malevolent spirit pressing down on the chest. There was no medical explanation available for such experiences. They were understood through the lens of spiritual warfare, and the response was prayer and protection. The morning brought relief. The return of daylight signalled the end of the night's spiritual dangers. The first task upon waking was often a brief prayer of thanks for having survived the night safely. This may seem excessive to modern understanding, but in a world without scientific explanations for natural phenomena, where illness and death could come suddenly and without warning, the night's dangers felt real. The protections used were not foolish. They provided psychological comfort, a sense of control in the face of uncertainty. They helped people sleep, which was essential for health and well-being, and so, as the household settled into the darkness, the prayers were said, the head coverings secured, the protective rituals completed. With these measures in place, sleep could come. The night could be faced, not with fear, but with the quiet confidence that sufficient precautions had been taken. The first light of dawn came slowly. The darkness did not vanish suddenly, but faded by degrees, the deep black softening to grey. Inside the household, this change was barely perceptible. The shuttered windows admitted only the faintest hint of the growing light outside. But it was enough. The body, attuned to the rhythm of day and night, sensed the approaching morning. Someone woke. Usually it was the same person who had banked the fire the night before, the one responsible for the household's warmth. The weight of that responsibility pulled them from sleep as dawn approached. The air in the room was cold. During the night the temperature dropped steadily. The heat stored in the walls and floor had dissipated. The banked fire had provided minimal warmth, just enough to keep the room from becoming dangerously cold. Rising from bed required effort. The wool blankets and the warmth they held were difficult to leave. But the day was beginning, and the fire needed attention. Bare feet touched the cold floor. The shock of it was immediate but expected. Thick wool socks or simple shoes kept near the bed were quickly pulled on. The person moved through the dark room carefully, guided by memory and habit. The layout was familiar. The path to the hearth was clear. At the hearth, they knelt. The dim greyness filtering through the shutters provided just enough light to work by. The poker was grasped, its iron handle cold even through the fabric wrapped around it for insulation. The ash covering the coals was pulled back slowly. This was a moment of uncertainty. Had the banking been successful? Were the coals still alive beneath their blanket of ash? As the ash was cleared away, the answer became visible. If the technique had been correct, if the balance of fuel and ash and air had been right, the coals would still be glowing. Sometimes they were bright, still giving off noticeable heat. Other times they were faint, barely visible, but alive. Either way, they were enough. Kindling was added. Small dry twigs and splinters of wood, kept in a basket near the hearth, specifically for this purpose. These were placed carefully on the coals, arranged to allow air to circulate. The person tending the fire would blow gently on the coals. The added oxygen was all they needed. The kindling began to smoke, then to char, and finally to ignite. A flame appeared, small at first but growing. It spread from one piece of kindling to the next, building quickly. Larger pieces of wood were added. Within a few minutes the fire was established, burning steadily, beginning to push back the cold. As the fire grew, light spread through the room, shadows retreated, the shapes of furniture, of sleeping forms became clear. The warmth followed. It radiated from the hearth, reaching first the immediate area and then slowly expanding outward. Others in the household began to wake. The light and the warmth were signals that the night was over. The day, with all its demands, was beginning. Children stirred, reluctant to leave the warmth of their pallets. Adults rose with more purpose, knowing that tasks awaited. The fire, now fully rekindled, became the focus of activity. Water was put on to heat. Preparations for the morning meal began. The household transitioned from the stillness of sleep to the motion of the day. Outside, the world was also waking. Birds began to call. In towns, church bells rang for morning prayers. In rural areas, roosters crowed, their calls echoing across the frozen fields. The morning light grew stronger. The deep cold of the night began to ease slightly, though the temperature would remain low throughout the day. But inside, with the fire burning, the household had warmth. The night had been survived. The fire had lasted. The routine had held. This was the measure of success in medieval winter life. Not comfort, not ease, but survival. Another night passed. Another morning reached. Another day to be lived. The embers that had glowed beneath their ash covering through the long hours of darkness had fulfilled their purpose. They had preserved the fire, maintained the household's lifeline through the coldest hours, and now, rekindled into flame, they would carry the household through the day. The fire would burn, the family would gather round it, work would be done, meals would be prepared. As evening approached again, the cycle would repeat. The fire would be tended through the day, banked again at night, and checked again at dawn. This was the rhythm of winter. This was how people lived, how they endured, how they survived the long, cold months before spring returned. The morning embers were not just the end of the night. They were the beginning of the day. They were the proof that the system worked, that the knowledge passed down through generations was sound, that the household could continue. And so, as the fire burned bright and the morning light filled the room, the people of medieval England rose to face another winter day. The night was behind them. The cold remained, but so did the fire, and as long as the fire burned, life went on.